Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Glad that you're here. We're just going to give it another minute or two, just let people log on. We got quite a few attendees today, so we are anxious to get started as well. Okay, so it's 12:01, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us, and just as a reminder, you will be able to get a copy of this probably in a few days after the webinar is over. So welcome to another edition in the RTS webinar series, where we present deep conversations on relevant topics to the industry. And today I'm thrilled to be co-presenting with a very close friend of mine, Dr. Melissa Hughes, who knows more about the neuroscience and the brain's inner workings than anyone I know. She's authored a book called Happy Hour with Einstein, which is available on Amazon. Melissa's worked with me with a few clients as we've learned about the power of engaging their workforce and learning how to be better people, which results in being better leaders. And we've had some amazing success as a result of that. I also want to welcome our FRLA members. The Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association has partnered with us on this webinar series, as well as on some of their live conferences. Our topic today is Culture Eats Strategy for Lunch, which is a famous quote by Peter Drucker. And the reason we chose this is because in the work that we've done with emerging brands and with turnaround situations, the one thing in common that we find with companies that strive for success to maintain it or to recapture it is that the secret to winning is really their culture, their team. And we're going to get into that today. This is talking about sort of hard things about soft issues that turns out to be a very, very powerful, powerful force. Now, Peter Drucker, for those of you who don't know, is regarded as the father of modern management. He was interested in the growing effect of people who work with their minds rather than their hands. And that's very important in today's workforce, where knowledge work is more important. And even in the restaurants, at the restaurant level, having people with good judgment, good listening skills, good emotional intelligence is very, very crucial. He was intrigued by employees who knew more about certain subjects than their bosses or colleagues, and yet had to cooperate with others in a large organization. Rather than simply glorifying the phenomenon as the epitome of human progress, Drucker analyzed it and explained how it challenged the common thinking about how organizations should be run. So Melissa, let's get right into it. Let's start off with what are the negative effects that can happen in a culture?
Thanks, Fred. I am super excited to be here with you today, and I know that everyone is really looking for the secret sauce to more engaged employees and a healthy company culture. And I think it's really important to look at the organizational and individual perspectives, because when we understand those factors that impact the individual, it's really easy to see how they impact the organization, both positively and negatively. And there was a time that we really believed that the leading contributors of a heart attack were factors like smoking or high blood pressure and high cholesterol. But recent research indicates that emotional aspects may be an even bigger contributor than we once thought. Studies show that heart attacks are 20% higher on Monday mornings, and that is largely due to stress. And we know this because the phenomenon is not observed on Monday holidays. So scientists have concluded that this isn't a Monday thing, this is a work thing. And as our stress level rises, so does the action in the very center of our brain called the amygdala. And this triggers a release of stress hormones, the cortisol and adrenaline. And these hormones temporarily affect our breathing and our heart rate and our blood pressure, but they also activate, the amygdala also activates bone marrow and inflammation of the arteries that cause stress conditions on the heart. But in addition to that, even if we don't have a heart attack, work-related stress is just not good for your health in a lot of other ways. We gain weight, we have a lower immune system, it hurts our relationships, our sleep patterns are impacted. And Fred, I'm thinking you are even going to be able to tell us how it isn't good for the company either.
Well, the thing that's interesting, and now that we're thoroughly depressed, is that the workforce is also, some studies been done by Gallup to show that a lot of the workforce is not actively engaged. Less than 30% of the workforce is actively engaged. More than 50% is not engaged, and some are actively disengaged, which means they're busy trying to create problems for your company and for your brand. And that's one of the challenges that we have in today's society. And so what we're going to talk about today is to figure out ways that we can fix this. Now, the restaurant industry, I think this issue is even more critical because we're so used to over 100% turnover that has got to change because we have a looming labor shortage. And so we need to figure something out about how do we start engaging our workforce? Because again, in the work that we've done, all the successful turnarounds that we have worked on have been a result of getting that workforce engaged. And we want to help leaders on this call learn how to really do that in a positive way. So, Melissa, what do you think?
Well, in order to do that, I think we need to look at how we can blend love and work. And, when you think about what makes humans different from every other living thing on the planet, it's making life meaningful and finding purpose. And Sigmund Freud famously wrote, "Love and work are the cornerstones of our humanness." And indeed, they are. They are the very foundation upon which we find meaning. And if you think about it, our lives revolve hour after hour on our relationships with others, and they're organized and structured around our work. We spend more time at work than anywhere else. We spend more time with colleagues than with anyone else. And this is so whether our work and our relationships are enjoyable and fulfilling or not. And so the balance between love and work in our lives has a direct impact on the purpose and meaning of our lives. So Fred, the million-dollar question then is, how do you combine the two so that you can nurture your own needs as well as meet the needs of the organization?
So today we're going to cover three basic themes. One is what is culture, culture in action, and then the outcomes as a result of a positive culture. And so a few things that we'll point out to the audience. I know some of you are checking email while you're trying to listen to this, and that's fine. You will get a copy of this later on, but let's really start answering the question, what is culture? And why do we call this the secret to winning? And how can we really influence culture? So a simple definition of culture is the embodied values, principles, and practices underlying the social fabric of a business, which permeates its actions and connects the stakeholders to each other and to the company's purpose, people, and processes. So that's a very nice, fancy definition of culture. I like to use a different metaphor for that. And to me, culture is like a giant swimming pool that we all swim in. And the quality and clarity of the water is dependent upon each and every single one of us. We are all responsible for culture. The leaders at the top are not the sole, stewards of culture. Every single employee is part of that culture. And that's why it's so important to understand that. But the most important thing I like to tell people is there is no peeing section in a swimming pool. We each have a piece to do to contribute to this. And if there's toxicity in the culture, everyone's affected by it. You cannot remain free and clear of it. It's not us and them, it's always we. So let's look broadly at how companies can succeed in this aspect of it. So there are two questions every CEO or leader needs to ask. One, is my organization smart? Number two, is my organization healthy? So Melissa, if you can just let us know your point of view and explain what smart and healthy look like.
Sure. So when we think of smart, we think of IQ, right? And IQ has been around for a really long time. Most people are really familiar with Alfred Binet's IQ test that showed up around 1905, and we still use it today. And just as an interesting fun fact, when we think of IQ, we think of one of my favorite guys, and that's Albert Einstein. And his name is synonymous with genius, but his IQ was 160, and there is some dispute as to who had the highest IQ. But intelligence is really measured as our ability to learn, our ability to understand and apply information to skills. And for a long time, this was the measure of smarts. But the concept of emotional intelligence came on the scene in about 1985, and it showed up in a doctoral thesis called The Study of Emotion. But it wasn't until 1995 that Daniel Goldman really expanded on this concept of how emotional intelligence can actually matter more than IQ. And, emotional intelligence is really the ability to identify and assess and control not just your own emotions, but the emotions of those around you. For a long time, IQ was believed to be that ultimate measure, and now we have studies that show that there is a direct relation between high emotional intelligence and success. And people with high EQ generally achieve more, they excel at teamwork and service, and they take more initiative in the workplace. And part of this is because so much of our work is collaborative. And because of that, EQ is now commonly integrated into new hire assessments. HR professionals are learning how to integrate that into how they hire and how they train new folks. There are a lot of different perspectives on whether EQ or IQ is more important. And some believe that a high IQ will get you through school, but a high EQ will get you through life. So Fred, being intellectually smart doesn't necessarily mean you're emotionally smart, but there is a wealth of research showing that emotional intelligence does enhance cognitive function. The question is, how do they show up in the organization?
No, that's great. And the good news is this: as IQ is like a light bulb. If you're a 100-watt bulb, that's all you get, and it's up to us to get to that capacity. If you're a 150-watt bulb, good for you. If you're like Einstein, 165, fantastic. The best news I ever heard when I started understanding a little bit more about EQ is that EQ can actually be increased. So it's not limited. You can actually enhance and increase your emotional intelligence through the work that you try and do and try and learn from. But let's go to your favorite human that ever lived, Melissa, Einstein. So the epitome of smart. And what smart really means? At a simple level, you're trying to get a competitive advantage over your competitors. You want to make sure you know how you make money. You know your guests, you have an intimate relationship with them, you're aware of the price of entry for your brand, you review it annually. And what that means for the restaurant business is that a list of top 10 things that you have to have as a table stakes in your concept should be reviewed annually because it's always changing as the customer changes. And then you evolve your points of differentiation to make sure that you can keep that competitive edge. And you're also very familiar with the competitors' operations as much as your own. That's some of the elements of being smart. Now, being healthy is slightly different. This is that EQ side. It starts by creating a work environment that it really stimulates people to perform to their highest capacity. And as is highlighted here, a place that you'd want your sons and daughters to work within. Think nowadays about the Me Too movement. If you're a father of a daughter and you're concerned about sexual harassment in the workplace, you're thrilled to know that this Me Too movement is taking shape and is making sure that it's a safe environment for your daughter to work with, or even your wife if you have a working wife. That's another consideration to be looking at. And so being healthy is a critical piece. And quite honestly, if I had a choice between having a healthy company or a smart company, given a choice of one or the other, I'll always take a healthy company because they'll figure it out. They've got each other's back. A smart company that has no moral compass will eat their young. And that's one of the things that I would be concerned about. So this is all about having a culture that challenges its employees, recognizes and rewards people, assumes the best in people and asks for help, and manages fear through transparent and honest communication. So Melissa, what's the foundation of a healthy culture?
Fred, if you go back to that original definition of culture that you shared earlier, that culture is the embodied values, principles, and practices that underlie the social fabric of a business. It kind of boils down to these four main elements, and it's trust and psychological safety, emotional intelligence, and organizational mindset. But the thing is, all of these things don't just happen. Before we drill into each of these elements, I think it's important to take a look at where we manage each of these in the brain and then how they influence the way we think, because I think that's the essence of it all, how we think and how we learn.
Now for the audience,
this is the part where, go ahead.
Yeah, the audience is not watching the screen. Now's the time to watch the screen for a few minutes because it'll give you a sense of understanding. This is new stuff for many people, and so I'm going to encourage you to pay attention to this.
And this is the part where I get to get my geek on. So to understand psychological safety or trust or either type of intelligence, we really have to have a basic understanding of the brain. And most people tend to think of the brain in terms of left brain, right brain. But I want to talk about upstairs, downstairs. And the best way to explain the difference is this. The upstairs brain responds. The downstairs brain reacts. All of our rational thinking happens upstairs in the executive state, and it's where our intellectual intelligence lives, and it's where our emotional intelligence lives, and it's where we'd all like to think that we hang out most of the time. But here's the bad news. That's just not true, because the emotional and survival areas, the downstairs brain, that's our default mode, and it's much more powerful than the executive state. And this is because the downstairs brain is largely in charge of keeping us alive. It takes care of all of those autonomic functions such as heart rate and breathing and body temperature and a host of other things. But those parts of the brain are designed to react very, very quickly rather than to respond very thoughtfully, because they're in charge of keeping us alive. When we're learning, the prefrontal lobes are engaged and in charge. When we're in danger or feeling threatened, our survival brain is engaged and in charge. But here's the key. Right in the middle is our emotional brain. And when we're processing any kind of emotion, the emotional brain is in charge. And the limbic system inside that emotional brain determines which chemicals to release. Positive emotions stimulate the release of chemicals that go upstairs to facilitate the executive thinking brain. But negative emotions stimulate the release of chemicals that go downstairs to activate the survival brain. So when the survival brain is in charge, and this is really, really key, it literally shuts down the activity in the thinking brain as a way of allocating all of the brain power to deal with the danger. So from a brain perspective, it literally isn't possible to be stressed and anxious or threatened and do your best thinking. The brain just doesn't function that way. So operating from a rational brain, this is where our intentional, thoughtful, mindful, and deliberate mental functions take place. And this is where we're able to tap into the emotional intelligence and our mindset. Fred, I think that really to understand the four elements of the organizational culture, let's start with trust, because trust is probably at the key of all of this. If there is no trust, it's really hard to make anything else happen.
No, that's absolutely true. It is the cornerstone of all relationships and communication. So this just shows you very briefly a graphic of the trust scale. Trust always starts in the middle at maybe, and from there, depending upon the behavior and the consistency of someone's behavior, we move upward into conditional or trustworthy or unconditional trust, or downward into skepticism, distrust, and ultimately betrayal. It's dynamic. Trust is never fixed. It always is dependent upon what's going on at that point in time. So it's always measured in degrees and not absolutes. And by far, betrayal is the worst type of mistrust that can occur. It's hard to come back from that, especially in a personal relationship. But even in a business relationship, it's important. And trust is measured not just between individuals, but it's also measured organizationally. So Melissa, let's talk a little bit more about some of that psychological danger and safety you're talking about that's so important in our brain.
Great. So psychological safety really relates to a person's perspective on how threatening or rewarding it is to take a risk in any relationship. So we're talking about the workplace, so let's talk about our collegial relationships. So do people in your organization feel like they have the safety to share new ideas, or are they going to be ridiculed or dismissed, right? When you think about your sense of psychological safety in your organization, do you think, will my colleagues embarrass or punish me for offering up a new point of view, or for even worse, admitting I don't understand something? I mean, that is the essence of learning. So those organizations that foster a sense of psychological danger create a very different culture. Their culture is one of fear or competition or groupthink. And groupthink is actually the fastest way to cripple innovation and creativity. And this is that psychological phenomenon that occurs within a group of people in which the desire for harmony or conformity in the group results in irrational or dysfunctional decision making. So actually being too nice can hurt the company. On the other hand, organizations that nurture a sense of psychological safety encourage collaboration, and they encourage that open exchange of ideas. And this results in more ideas, and more ideas are better ideas and better decision making, and ultimately higher employee engagement. And a key finding when you look at the literature on psychological danger and psychological safety, a key finding in study after study is that teams that made more mistakes were actually more successful, because people feel like they can make mistakes when they're in an environment where they can take risks, and it is those risks that foster innovation. So from that kind of foundation of trust and psychological safety, now we can start to talk about what emotional intelligence really looks like and how that plays in the organization.
Yeah, you know, Melissa, as you're talking about that, I always think about when we start off with a new client and we talk about, do you have a zinger culture? And people look at me with a blank stare, and I said, do you make jokes at each other's expense? You sort of make a joke at the expense of someone else, thinking it's funny, the whole group laughs. And in most restaurant companies, the answer is yes. And we've learned over time that that is one of the worst type of cultures to have, because people don't feel safe. They're not able to share their ideas because they never know if they're going to be put down. And as leaders, we're the ones that set that entire tone. And I always encourage leaders to speak last in the room, because as soon as the leader says, I think this, then everyone just falls in line and match step. And that's what the psychological danger safety falls into. And leading into emotional intelligence, there's really 4 dimensions to it. There's a personal competence and a social competence. At a personal level, you have self-awareness. And if you ever meet anyone who says, I'm self-aware, big clue, they're not. Because anyone who attempts to be self-aware finds out immediately how humbling the experience is, because we're trapped in our heads. Human beings think between 65,000 to 80,000 thoughts a day. 90% of them are the same ones, day after day after day after day. So practicing some form of mindfulness and self-awareness will help you understand what it is you're feeling and experiencing, so you can get to the next level, which is self-management. I feel or I sense the impulse. I have an urge to lash out or say some snide remark or throw out a zinger, and I restrain myself from that because I realize it's not going to be effective for me. And that takes you into social competence, which is social awareness, which is you become aware that what you say affects others in a certain specific way. And if you become mindful of that and realize that you want to lead a team or influence a coworker or influence the chairman of the board, then your behavior can influence and affect their behavior, which gets into relationship management. And as I said earlier, if you're not good at those emotional intelligence, you can find yourself increasing it over time, starting with the first step, which is the self-awareness, and going from there.
And Fred, just if I could just jump in here, from a neurological perspective, you can't get to the emotional intelligence part. You can't ask yourselves and actually assess all of those things within yourself or others unless there is that trust and psychological safety. So, that building on those 2 elements, you're never going to get to the self-awareness piece if you don't feel safe. Most people are aware of personal mindset as being fixed or growth, or a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. But a lot of people aren't aware that an organization can also have a mindset, and that mindset drives behavior. So when you think about a person who has a fixed mindset, this is a person who believes, we really don't have any control over intelligence and talent. What we have is what we have, and we can do very little about it. But someone with a growth mindset recognizes that the brain is a muscle, like any other muscle in the body. And thanks to neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, we can grow that muscle. We can grow brain cells, and we can stretch and learn, and we can grow our capacity to learn and solve problems and develop new skills. And a good example to use to illustrate this is, when you ask folks if they have artistic ability. Some people will say, I don't have a creative bone in my body. And that is a very fixed mindset, because someone with a growth mindset will believe that artistic ability, just like reading or math or a host of other skills that you can learn, can be developed and grown. And research has really been expanded over the last, 2 decades or so, to explore whether an organization can cultivate a fixed or growth mindset, and if so, how that impacts engagement and defines workplace norms and behavior. And any type of workplace environment, academic, business, nonprofit, doesn't matter. Every organization communicates a cultural mindset through those shared norms and values. And in correlation with a growth or fixed mindset, cultures, organizational cultures can be defined as a genius or development mindset. And from there, that determines whether that culture will be competitive versus collaborative. And we'll get into a little bit more of what a genius culture looks like versus a development culture. But Fred, all of these factors are ingredients in the culture of a company. And I think the key is understanding how this translates to what actually happens in the workplace. And this is the part that you get really jazzed about.
Yeah, I do get excited about it. This is the part that I find thrilling in companies. If we walk into a toxic culture to help them realize and change it, or we walk into a really healthy culture, but it's an unconscious one where they're just doing the right thing naturally, intuitively, but they haven't set parameters and norms around it. And what's incredible is the business results will skyrocket once the culture gets better. The team becomes resilient, loyalty increases, and they're ready to have any kind of adversity. So this is the fun part. This is where leaders on this webinar can learn to really do something about it to influence that culture. You can't control culture, you can only influence it. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite quotes by Brene Brown, who's a cultural anthropologist. And she says, people are not rational beings with occasional emotion. They are emotional beings with occasional rational thought. And when I first heard that, it was revolutionary to me, because it helped me realize that what we need to manage as leaders in many cases is people's emotional state. So Melissa talked about psychological safety. I talk about zinger cultures being negative. And the reason for that is that because people just don't feel safe. And Melissa said before that means that puts you down to your bottom brain, which is fight or flight, rather than your upper brain, which is able to be thoughtful and reasonable and do things like that. So we use several instruments when we work with companies in that regard. We spend time with companies in a communication and culture workshop. We use the DISC assessment for personal style. And then we use the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team put on by the table group to talk about how the team culture is. And you can see that the foundation of team culture is trust. Then it goes into their ability to handle conflict. And then ultimately there are commitment around ideas to make sure that they can get things done, and the ability to hold each other accountable for results. And lastly, what are those results? And that assessment measures this, and we use it on an annual basis to sort of see how people have progressed. I've had clients who are all red on this scale. Some are a mixture of red, yellow, and green. And then when you get to the peak, you're all green. And it's dynamic. Once you arrive, you don't end. You keep on going. But it's about making sure you keep those rules alive and around how you're going to behave within your team culture. And that's really, really important. So Melissa, I know Google's done a tremendous amount of work in this space because they've done millions of dollars in research. Can you share some of the insights in terms of what happens?
Yeah, so Google, they spend a ton of money trying to figure out the secret, the scientific secret to everything. And a few years ago, they really wanted to know what makes some teams thrive while others just struggle to survive. And they pulled together scientists and mathematicians and statisticians and psychologists, and they put all these folks together in a room, and they initiated a project called Project Aristotle. It was a 5-year study in the end, I believe, and it had more than 200 interviews and 180 active teams. So it was a really, really large sample size, and it was a robust study. What they found was that there were 3 main things that attributed to a team's success. One was psychological safety. We've been talking about that, right? How safe do people feel to share their own ideas? How safe do they feel to engage? If we want people to engage, we have to make them feel safe enough to engage. The second is this concept that they called conversational turn taking. And all that means is, if you have a team of 4, how many of those 4 are participating? If only 2 people are participating in the conversation, then that means you've cut that workforce on that team in half. So if you apply that to your entire organization, how successful can your organization be if you cut half of your workforce out? And for those folks, we go back, Fred, to those stats that you showed in the very beginning about the level of disengagement in today's workforces. those folks that are not engaged, they are not contributing. They are not participating in either the conversation or the work. And then the third piece is social sensitivity. And this is what you were talking about earlier, in the emotional intelligence. Being able to understand what drives people, when people are in shape, and I know you talk about being in shape and being out of shape, being able to understand why, and then modifying your own behavior, your own communication, your own strategies, so that instead of exacerbating the problem, you actually help that person get back into shape. So it's not rocket science. They spend a whole bunch of money to come up with things that really are pretty common sense. Earlier, I talked a little bit too about the organizational mindset, those that are genius and those that are development. And there was a 2-year study conducted of Fortune 1000 companies. And what they found was those companies that were classified as genius are those companies that are inequitable and mistrusting and dishonest. Those are the kind of words that employees use to describe their own companies. They reported extreme competition and unethical behaviors, cheating, shortcuts, cutting corners, hiding information, keeping secrets. And a lot of people felt that only a few people that were really valued and respected, and the company just largely didn't care about the rest. These are the companies that people kind of fly under the radar, and they, it's a CYA kind of climate. When people focus on continually proving how smart they are, because if they want to be respected in a genius culture, they have to prove how smart they are, then, they ignore or avoid or abandon valuable learning opportunities. And they only feel that innovation and hard work are rewarded if they're successful. So they're much more likely to play it safe. And that's why we call them the fly under the radar companies. On the other hand, the fixed mindset companies, on the other hand, the genius of the development companies describe their companies as having cultures of growth, and they report greater trust and a greater commitment to the company. They have stronger support for taking risks and coming up with innovative thoughts and creative projects. They're 47% more likely to agree with statements related to trust in the company, and 34% more likely to show a sense of ownership and commitment to the overall success of the company. They also showed a stronger agreement that the company supported risk-taking and creative endeavors, but perhaps the most significant difference is what they said about initiative and change. In the genius cultures, people really demonstrated a resistance, an entrenched resistance to change, but those in cultures of development assumed ownership over making improvements, and they really wanted to know how their role would impact the bigger picture and what they could do to contribute more. When you look at two different companies, I'll give you an example of a genius company and a development company. I think it'll all become clear. So in the genius company, this is a description of one genius company that prized brain power. It was all about how smart their people were. They focused on being the intellectual rock stars, right? And it was an environment where from the top, people wanted to be described as being the smartest guy in the room. And so anyone that disagreed with anyone was dismissed as not being bright enough to get it. That is the kind of culture that is nurtured from the top. And this genius description is actually the description of Enron, right? They believe in stars because they don't believe in systems. The focus is on the individual brilliance. And Malcolm Gladwell actually analyzed this concept of genius culture, and he said this makes sense because groups don't write novels, and a committee didn't come up with the theory of relativity, but companies work by different rules. And if we want people to engage, we want them to engage together. They just don't create, but they execute and they compete and they coordinate the efforts of a lot of different people and a lot of different functions. And the organizations that are most successful are the ones where the system is the star. On the other hand, the development culture that is described here, talks about expecting people to show a passion and a love for learning and expanding their knowledge. And instead of proving how smart they are, the focus is on, how people contribute and how the company can invest in growth, professional growth, and develop a larger portion of talent and on-the-job learning. And this particular description is a description of Xerox back in 2000. And Xerox was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was $17 billion in debt, and stock plummeted from $63 and change a share to a little over $4 a share. So here was this company on the verge of collapse. But Money Magazine back in 2000 called this the great turnaround story of the post-crash era. And Anne Mulcahy was the new CEO at the time, and she attributes the success of that company to a focus of intense on-the-job learning, starting at the top. She said that communication was one of the most important elements of that strategy, and the fact that she expected participation from every employee, and because of those high expectations and because of this intense focus on communication and learning, people participated. So it's really easy to see the difference between the genius and the development approach. Xerox created a team focused on a commitment to identifying problems and learning how to fix them. And Enron created a team focused on competition, how to compete with one another. Everybody's striving to be the smartest guy in the room.
Yeah, that's amazing. This reminds me of what I said earlier about healthy and smart. Enron was definitely smart, but not healthy. And in the case of Xerox, they were healthy and maybe and smart. So it's a great story. So let's move on into some more facts-based information regarding this, Melissa.
Yeah, when you think about the difference between those two companies, other than the focus on communication and learning, at the very foundation of both of them is either trust or no trust, right? So in this study, trust was the biggest deal. Company employees in a growth mindset expressed 47% higher agreement with statements about having more trust in their companies. They were able to put themselves out there. And I know, Fred, you talk a lot about being vulnerable and, showing your soft underbelly, right? But that biggest part of being able to develop and grow is being vulnerable enough to say, I don't know how, but somebody here does, and I'm going to go find out. And in order to find out, you have to admit that you don't know how. And that takes a lot of trust.
No, that's great. You're right. And so the foundation of this is just at the real simple level is let's understand what happens in communication, because communication is part of what lubricates trust. And so the process of communication is you have intent, the behavior that follows it, and the reaction. And that the way it typically works is that us as people, as senders, we know our intent and then we behave a specific way. The receiver just sees the behavior and then reacts to it with their interpretation of what it is. And that becomes the foundation of miscommunication. Because if you're not clear on what someone's intention is and you presume to know what it is, it creates a problem. And so this next model will sort of show you how that occurs. The definition of communication is transferring meaning to achieve understanding. However, as Melissa's going to elaborate, that is not what typically happens if there's not the intention is not being telegraphed. So Melissa, let's walk through this.
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that most conflicts are really not about, the problem is never the problem is always something else. Most conflicts in the workplace are misunderstandings and communication gaps. When you kind of factor in generational differences, think about the way baby boomers communicate versus Gen Xers and millennials, and right around the corner we'll have Gen Z pretty soon. Think about sprinkle in personal management styles and educational background and cultural diversity and experiences. All of these things, you mix them all up and they can all be potential sources of office misunderstandings. And I think the important yet difficult piece of this is personalizing it, because we tend to make everything about us. It's always all about us. And I'll give you a really simple example. an employee works really hard on this innovative proposal and sends it, to her boss, and she's so excited. She can't wait for the feedback. She thinks it's really awesome. She thinks her boss is really going to love it. And a day goes by and another day goes by and she doesn't hear anything. And she doesn't hear anything. And she keeps watching for her boss to give her some of that feedback. And she doesn't get any feedback, but her boss gets really stressed out. She's been in a bad mood all week. So the translation of this is immediately the employee says, she hates my proposal. I know she hates my proposal. I sent it to her on Monday. I haven't heard anything. She hasn't said anything, and she's in a bad mood. She hates my proposal. The reality is far different. Perhaps her boss is stressed out because she has to cut 2 people from the team due to budget cuts. We jump to irrational conclusions all the time without even being aware. We assume that we have all of the information we need to form a conclusion. But in fact, that is seldom the case. The human brain is a pattern machine. We look for patterns, and even when we can't find them, we kind of manufacture them. Like, this illogical, if then I know, it jumps to that irrational conclusion. But if you take this and apply it, it applies across the board. People don't go to work with the intent of making their colleagues miserable. I believe people want to be engaged, and I believe that leaders want to give them what they need to be engaged. But sometimes that intent gets lost in translation of some really, really common behaviors. So no one wants to communicate to their team that what they do isn't important, that they aren't capable of contributing, or that they have no confidence in their abilities. But that guy that consistently cancels or blows off meetings, and it may be because, for a very good reason, he's really busy, or he's got a boss that's breathing down his neck. It doesn't matter, but that communicates that the people on the team that you keep blowing that meeting off, it's just not important. Or when we fail to ask people for their ideas and their thoughts, the communication is, well, you have nothing to contribute. I've got all the answers. I don't need your thoughts. When you've got those micromanagers leading people, that translates into I have very little confidence in your abilities. And probably the biggest one, and the one that impacts the company the most, is the easiest one. This is the one we learned in kindergarten. When we don't recognize and thank people for the efforts, for contributing, for making our jobs easier, we communicate that what they do really doesn't matter. And Fred, this is part of that, a great book for this, and is a book that you shared with me, and that was Bob Chapman's book, What Everybody
Matters.
Right, Everybody Matters. But it is so powerful, and it is often so overlooked. And sometimes just a simple expression of gratitude or a recognition of someone's effort can make the whole difference between an engaged employee and an unengaged one.
That's fantastic. And of course, this miscommunication ultimately results in conflict. Now, again, for those of you on this webinar who are in personal relationships, you might pay attention to this because it might help you clarify some things at home. A lot of what happens is that miscommunication where people assume an intention without asking for clarity around it. So the way to do it, and we work with companies that help them learn how to manage conflict, is to get the 2 parties involved. Sometimes it requires a 3rd-party mediator, but they can do it by themselves if they're mature enough, is to ask permission to provide feedback, to telegraph an intent. Gee, Melissa, I'd like to meet with you for coffee tomorrow because something happened during yesterday's staff meeting that's really bothered me, and I want to get some clarity around that. Is that okay? So I tell her what it is that I'm trying to accomplish, and I'm focused on the behavior, and I'm saying, gee, Melissa, you were a horrible person yesterday. I need to talk about it right now. That's not the right way to approach it. You want to focus on behavior. And the key phrase here is to listen, to understand, not to reply. All the type A personalities on this call, all the aggressive winners want to win, have a tendency to listen to reply rather than listen to understand. And so when you listen to understand, not to reply, the best practice is to mirror back what you've heard. I heard you say the following. Yesterday at the meeting, I behaved in a certain way. If all of you don't want to feel that way, you'd like me to behave differently. Is that what you said? And if I'm listened to and heard and validated, then I can say, yes, that's what I said. Now, you don't have to agree with me, but you validated you heard me, which is the most important thing. And then you can reach an agreement to disagree if that's what you want to do. but ultimately the goal is to have some sort of understanding and validation of the other person. It's all about making sure that you recognize that you do have diversity of thought. People perceive things differently for all the reasons Melissa mentioned earlier. So Melissa, I think you want to talk a little bit about group thinking.
Yeah, so, we talked a little bit, I think I mentioned group thinking, and that's the easiest way to cripple innovation and creative thought. And this whole concept of diversity has kind of been a big buzzword, the last few years, and diversity is so important. But it is actually the art of thinking independently together. And Fred, if you could just forward to the next slide there. I think that this photo does a great job of illustrating that. Did we lose Fred?
Down here, the screen out advance.
Mine did it, so I don't know, maybe we'll see.
On the we're on the diversity side.
Yeah, so Malcolm Forbes, oh, there we go. Malcolm Forbes has said, diversity is the art of thinking independently together. And I think the important piece is that inherently we are diverse because we bring our own personalities, we bring our own strengths, we bring our own weaknesses, we bring, our interests, and everything is different. We're all unique in that way. But, this is different than the smile and nod culture. Smile and nod culture, that leads to groupthink. This is giving everybody that freedom to bring their best and their strengths and their weaknesses to the table and learn from all of that. So I think this is a great quote there. And you know what? It doesn't happen by accident. It's something that really requires leadership, intentional leadership.
Right, and that, and once again, back to Peter Drucker, who inspired this webinar, only three things happen naturally in organizations: friction, confusion, and underperformance. Everything else requires leadership. And in our work, what we've done is Melissa and I have shared a passion for conscious capitalism. And Conscious Capitalism is a national organization that was co-founded by John Mackey, who is the founder of Whole Foods, as well as Raj Sisodia, who is a professor from Babson. And they wrote a book called Conscious Capitalism. And the four tenets of conscious capitalism, which dovetails perfectly in how to engage your workforce, starts with one, a higher purpose. So Melissa, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, going back to Freud, this is what purpose and meaning in life is, what separates us from every other living thing on the planet. And, this sense of purpose is what activates us and motivates us. It's what moves us to get up in the morning. And it is what gives us that sense of tenacity and resilience, when the inevitable orange cones pop up along the way. And conscious businesses provide us with that sense of meaning and purpose, and they know how to nurture that within us.
Well, then also then goes to stakeholder mentality, and the idea there, the orientation of the stakeholder is that everyone has to win 360. It's not just the shareholders, it's also the employees, the vendors, the community, your customers, and all that leads into this. And it starts with that buzzword of leadership. So Melissa, let's talk about leadership.
Yeah, so I don't know what the stat is off the top of my head, but I think that number one cause of people leaving a position or being disgruntled and leaving is because they have a bad boss. And good leaders have to be good servants first, and conscious leaders focus on we rather than me. They inspire and foster transformation, and I think the key is that great leaders are able to bring out the best in the team. They understand that their role is to serve the purpose of the organization, and when they support the people within the organization and create value for everyone, the entire organization wins. That leads to culture.
And the culture, as we've been talking about today, is so critical, and that's that secret weapon. So the outcomes for this in business are pretty remarkable. It's not just about feeling good. It's about the fact that it makes a difference. So this is the results of a book called Firms of Endearment, also written by Raj Sisodia. And you can see that their average return was 13% compared to the S&P 500, which is 4%. So financial performance is improved. And it's real simple if you stop and think about it. Every single employee you have working for you is actually trying to help you in your business. You will be much more successful than the ones that do not have that kind of pull people. And so the book Firms of Endearment, these are the companies that are part of that were in that study. They make a big difference to have a conscious culture. And as I said earlier, their performance by far 14 to 1 over the standard S&P 500, and also better than the good to great companies. And good to great companies, of course, got a lot of notoriety in Collins' book. Melissa, the Fortune magazine is the place to work. And
sure. My slide hasn't advanced yet, but in the, every year Fortune does a series on the best companies to work for. And what's interesting about the companies that are identified as the greatest places to work is that it isn't about the perks, and it isn't even necessarily about the salaries, but it's really about teams that are talented, transparent, and aligned. And at the root of all of that is trust and credible and respectful leadership, and taking pride in the work that they do and having a camaraderie. So I think that the other piece that really that I pulled out of the background of the greatest places to work is that employees who say that they have a great place to work were 4 times more likely to say that they're willing to give extra to get the job done. And that is what we want. That's what we want our folks to, we want them to be that engaged, right?
Yeah, and the Whole Foods comes to mind, and I just brought up their statistics because of Conscious Capitalism, John Mackey being one of the founders. Whole Foods has always worked toward a higher purpose. You can go to their website to see what it is that they say about why they exist and who they serve. And they have a declaration of interdependence. They have a strict salary cap from the CEO down to the lowest paid employee of a 19 to 1 ratio. And a lot of companies nowadays have 1,000 to 1 ratio from the CEO down to the lowest paid employee. All salaries are transparent across the entire organization. Everyone knows what everybody else makes. They spend 80% less on marketing than most companies do, but they've returned over 2,000% to their investors. This does not mean that they don't get challenged. If you know the story about Whole Foods, they were about a year ago by Amazon because they had a lot of activists on their board trying to affect them to do things that were not in the best interest of the business, but were the best interest of a small group of shareholders. And that's one of the things that occurs. I think the whole point to this is that courageous leaders are the ones that make the difference. This is about leadership. And while this webinar has been about culture, we know that leadership is the key. In a later edition in one of our other webinars, we'll explore this elusive roles and understand, why does someone want to become a leader? What drives them to assume the responsibility of stewardship for a team? And what is it takes? It takes no courage to be silent. It takes a lot of amount of courage to be vulnerable, to be open. Many people live their lives trying to hang on to what they have without sharing. And what we're trying to do is learn to be generous in yourself and generous with your team to really get a much better result. One of the things we all share in common as humans is the ability to choose. Everything you do is based on the choices you make. It's not your parents, your past relationships, your job, the economy, the weather, an argument, or your age that's to blame. You and only you are responsible for every decision and choice you make, period. And that's the greatest contribution to culture anyone can make. If every employee would understand this, they would make a big difference in the culture that they work within. So rather than complain and bitch about things, it's make a difference by taking action. And what we want you to do is recognize that it does start with you by being radically open-minded. And being radically open-minded, it doesn't mean that you have to exclude everybody else or always listen to them to reach agreement. What it says is that closed-minded people don't want their ideas challenged. Open-minded people are not angry when someone disagrees. Closed-minded people are more likely to make statements rather than ask questions. Open-minded people genuinely believe they could be wrong and ask questions. That's why I always encourage leaders to speak last. Closed-minded people focus much more on being understood than understanding others. They're listening to reply, not listen to understand. Open-minded people always feel compelled to see things through others' eyes. Those are the great, conscious, intentional leaders. Closed-minded people lack a sense of humility. Open-minded people approach everything with the deep fear that they may be wrong and are willing to listen to someone else's point of view. And that basically brings us to the point of Q&A. If anyone has questions, you can fill it in on that little doc you have on the right of your screen and give a chance to ask Melissa or I questions. Or Melissa, if you've got a question in waiting, you might share that while people are typing theirs.
Yeah, I actually did get a question, Fred. Somebody said, I'm interested in learning more about psychological safety and some tangible steps to foster it in the organization. Can you speak to that? And I think that's a great question. If you want to learn more about psychological safety, Amy Edmondson has done a lot of work in this area, and there's a great TED Talk that she's done that speaks directly to building a psychologically safe workplace. But beyond that, some of the things that we talked about today, just Fred, some of the things that you shared, and being and understanding what conflict comes from and how communication leads to conflict or not. And then also just leading by example, all of those points that you just shared and being radically open-minded. That's kind of the essence of what a fairly new concept called intellectual humility. And intellectual humility is not just accepting that you could be wrong, but actively searching out people who will challenge those ideas, and that does take some humility. So if you're interested more in you can't do any of that unless there's psychological safety and trust. So Amy Edmondson does a lot on that.
So I have a question here. It says, so if you believe your company has a long way to go on building a healthy culture, where do you start? That's a great question. And it's that kind of quality of question that will make that difference. Number one, it starts with you. So if you're the owner of the business or the CEO of the business, you want to know how to start building a healthy culture, start with the aspects of emotional intelligence, that self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. We do work with individuals and teams to help them achieve this. Some of the assessments we take will help people understand how they communicate differently, along with the sort of the group assessment that we do to sort of define what the culture is like. And the assessments is not meant to be specifically accurate in the sense like it's like degrees where you got a fever, but it does give you an indication that there may be a lack of communication, there may be a lack of clarity. And the process we take people through will help them understand and explore that. And it's really revealing. I mean, people's favorite topic is themselves. It really is. And it's an opportunity to learn more about yourself, but then ultimately learn more about how people need to be communicated to. The golden rule is treat others as you would want them to treat you. I think there's a better one. The platinum rule is be treated as the way you want to be treated, treat others the way they want to be treated, not necessarily the way you want to be treated. And that makes a big difference. But if anyone wants to reach out to us, you have our email address there. We'll be happy to answer your questions. And we are going to get a copy of this webinar in a few days. And we look forward to having you join us once again. And thank you for the courtesy and giving us your time and attention today for Culture Eats Strategy for Lunch. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Thanks,
Goodbye,
everyone.
Lisa.